Hey everyone, welcome to the Photographer's Lair. This is my introductory edit feature for the Patreon mentorship group. This level of editing demo will be available regularly each week for the mid-level and upper-level patrons of the Photographer's Lair. So it's just a really good platform to provide subscribers with regular content each week and allow feedback and all kinds of good interactions. So for the upper level mentors, there's only going to be a max of 5 people allowed into that level, just because there's so much going on there that I don't want to get it to be something that I can't manage. You're going to get at that level actual photo shoots in the studio. If you're not local to the Indianapolis area or can't make it, all of that will be recorded, and I will make files available to you so that you can work through some of the editing demonstration portion of those shoots. A little hint, the first one coming up at the end of February is going to be a painterly portrait look. If you've seen any of my work on that before, it's something that I think is really powerful, and it's a beautiful look to play with. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think we're targeting doing that shoot on February 27th. It's Saturday. So if you're interested, sign up for that, and let's do this. It'll be really cool. Another question that I've had is this any contract or any maximum or minimum allowed? No. There is no contract. You can sign up for 1 month and leave, and no harm, no foul, no worries either way. My intent is that this is something that you actually get enough value out of that you stay a subscriber, and there will be bonus content provided for people that stick with the program for 3 months, 6 months, and a year. And still working out some of the details, but part of that is actually going to be, what do you guys want? So there will be some polls in each of the groups to get some kind of idea on what would be fun to have as far as a 3-month or 6-month reward. Beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of information in the description. The full mentor group, again, will have Zoom calls regularly as a group and individually, so you can get some one-to-one time to go over anything that you're working on. As well as the group calls will have image critiques, so we can sit down as a group and say, these are areas where your photos might be really strong, and maybe here's a few areas to take a look at doing something a little bit to try and improve them. And that's really what this is all about, is helping everybody improve their work, improve their business, and be better photographers. My whole philosophy on photography is never stop learning. Once you are done learning, you're done, because it's the way the modern world works is you keep evolving and developing, or you're falling behind. So that's my goal for myself, and I hope everybody is interested in coming along for the ride. Okay, so let's dive into the edit here. I want to show you guys, this is a shoot from last year with Dakota. She's an awesome local indie model, and I did a lighting demo with her. And you know, there you can see in the timeline, I've done a bunch of different little, you know, fun edits to these things, but I want to kind of go through the process of taking something like this to this kind of look. And this is what I'm kind of known for. I like these cinematic toned images that are kind of deep in the shadows and have this almost movie poster style to them. This is going to be kind of an intermediate look at Lightroom. So if you're completely brand new to Lightroom, don't worry, just take a look at all the different things we're going to go through here. And follow along if you want to, but if there's something that's just kind of way over your head or whatever, don't worry. we can step back and go back through a very beginner look at how to even just launch Lightroom and import your photos and export them. That's one thing with this mentor group, and I want to create content that you need, not just what I think people want. So if you're in there at the trooper level or the mentorship level, send me a note. Hey, I really need to figure out how to do this, and that will become one of the next demonstrations. So in Lightroom, you have the library module, which is your catalog of images, and the develop module. Develop is where you do all of the editing. So if we have this to start with, most of the time I do a lot of compositing, and I've gotten into just part of my look is when I first work with an image, I usually reduce the contrast. Just because all of the work that I do after this is actually going to add contrast back into it. So all of those settings up here are just kind of your initial adjustments to the image. You do have the option to do some preset kind of things. If you come in here to the Adobe Color module, they have all these different things, and you can just kind of hover over it and it will give you a preview. So their artistic gives it this little magenta cast and some other cool effects. So you can just quickly start with one of these if you want. I typically just stick with the general Adobe Color profile because that seems to be the most neutral thing. And that's what I like to start with. I don't want to go with anybody else's presets, and it's nothing against it. Sometimes those are pretty cool looks, whatever. If you want it, go play with that, feel free. You also have the option to do a black and white treatment up here as well, so cool. All right, back to the edit. I keep getting distracted. I think of all these other things that I should tell you guys. Here we go. So contrast. I also would probably with this image bring the highlights down just a little bit. Highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And this to me is a little bit backwards. It's just my brain. The whites and blacks are obviously the very brightest white point and very darkest black point of your image. Sliding these up or down increases the amount of the image that goes to white or black. Highlights and shadows are kind of in between. They're between the mid-range and blacks and in between the mid-range and the highlight and the whites for the highlights. So like with this hair, I can actually turn on an alert up here that shows me where it's all blown out. Same for the shadows. These two little boxes on the upper part of the histogram are your exposure alerts. So tip, if you start randomly getting this red overlay, or let's see, if I take the exposure down, you start getting a bunch of blue overlay like this and you're like, what in the world is going on? That's probably because somehow you've managed to click those alerts on and didn't realize it. So I want to go ahead and just take that back down. Now it's not necessarily bringing detail back on this one, it's just bringing it's still like white, but it's not completely white. Whatever, it does get a little bit of detail back, but this one was so blown out that it's not going to bring it all back. So whatever. Shadows, I like to bring the shadows up, and again this is part of reducing the contrast. Whites, I'm going to bring this back up a little bit, and there's that red again. And then the blacks, I'm going to bring it down. So exactly that part right there, bringing the shadows up reduces the contrast a little bit, but then I'm pushing contrast back into it by bringing whites higher and blacks darker. And you can see if I keep going with that, it gets really dark, right? I don't necessarily want to do that. Somewhere for this image around 22, 23 is good. This is all kind of touch and feel, and I know a lot of people when they say, well, how did you do that edit, and somebody says their settings and they go and replicate exactly those settings. Every image is different. You kind of want to do it by the look and feel and what the image looks like to you. Texture and clarity. they're very similar in that they increase or decrease very local contrast. Okay, so texture is really good for kind of actually enhancing the texture in something like this lacy shirt or hair. Clarity is almost like sharpening, and it's definitely something that you want to be careful with, because if you push it up too far, for instance, like we'll just take a look, you know, you really increase the skin texture here a whole lot, and you know, you can make something really horrible by pushing them all the way up. Typically with a model shoot like this, I'll take clarity up to around 15 to 20, and texture I'll just a little bit somewhere in the 5 to 10 range, and that just brings a little bit more sharpness into all of those things. I'm going to turn this highlight back off. But again, play with it. If you're doing a shoot that is architecture or landscape, sometimes you'll want to take that texture and clarity up even further, because it does really put a lot of punch into an image like that. Punch, like Kool-Aid. Especially something like if you got a rainy nighttime rain scene with like cobblestones and the light is shining across the brickwork or something like that. Pushing up that clarity can really make that pop, and it's kind of a cool effect. But be careful with it with people. That's all I'm saying. Dehaze. This one, it's kind of funky, but if you increase it, it reduces haze. If you decrease it, it increases haze, which is a little bit backwards thinking, but whatever. And with something that's backlit like this, I actually like haze. So I actually tend to bring this down around, you know, 14, negative 15-ish. Just because it gives it this kind of atmospheric look, and I like that look. You do what you like. Specifically what it does is, so like you've got this backlight here that is causing haze. It increases the contrast in that kind of a light area. And helps reduce the amount of the haze look that's going on there. Okay, Vibrance and Saturation. They're very similar, but work in a little bit of a different way. And I like to call Vibrance a smart saturation adjustment. In other words, if you take it all the way up to the top, it's oversaturated, but it doesn't look really, really bad. Whereas if you take saturation all the way up, it's super orange and everything else on her skin, and it's just way too much. On the flip side, if you take saturation all the way down, it's completely black and white. But Vibrance, there's still a hint of red in her lips and a little bit of color to her skin. It's not completely unsaturated when you go with Vibrance. So Vibrance kind of focuses on certain color groups and is I think a little bit of a curve to how it does its saturation adjustments. It's not completely linear like the regular saturation is. So I typically just use Vibrance unless I actually really want to go full on with the saturation or desaturating an image. And my style is typically a little bit desaturated. So I take Vibrance down 15 to 20. Something like that. Okay. Curves adjustments. Now, this is something that I will probably make a full dedicated video about, because there's a lot of power built into this deceptively simple curve. But the basics of it are that on the left side are your shadows, on the right side are your highlights. So if you bring up the black point, obviously your black levels in that image are now at this kind of mid-gray. You can bring it all the way up there. Same thing with the highlights, and you can make your entire image completely gray just by making it a straight line. Not that you want to do that. There is actually a reason for that. It's in Photoshop as a curves adjustment. We'll get to that. Ask me about that sometime. Undo that. So anyway, typically what I do with this is just a little bit of that black point up. And then you can do this with the individual color channels as well. So you've got your red, green, and blue. And the way you want to think about RGB is moving the red point up adds red to the image, bringing it down takes away red or adds cyan. And if you think about RGB versus CMYK, RGB, CMY, they're opposites of each other in this world. So R is the opposite of C, cyan. Green is the opposite of magenta. Blue is the opposite of yellow. So if you pull this one down, you get more yellow. Push it up, you get more blue. But the same thing I was showing you with the shadows and highlights, you can put just a little bit of color grading into an image by bringing the blue and green points up. So this is pushing sort of a blue-green, almost like the cyan, into the shadows. And then with the highlights, I want to put in just a little bit of red. That might be too much. And a little bit of yellow. There's also the color grading section later on, so I'm going to reset this. Reset all channels. Jeez, duh. You gotta click in here. Okay, so I reset that. Go back to just this little bit here on the shadows. Then you have your individual color channel mixer. And there's two ways to look at this. You can go with, individual colors or all of the colors listed. And so you have hue, saturation, and luminance or brightness values for each of those colors. You can also break it down to hue, saturation, and luminance with individual colors under each of those. The cool thing with looking at it under HSL is that you have this little button up here. So if you say, for instance, want to, increase the brightness on her face, but you're not 100% sure where, what color to adjust to do that. A little hint, it's in the orange channel, a little bit of red and yellow, but most people's skin is mostly orange. But you can come and pick this little button here and then just click on a part in the image and slide that up, and you can see it's taking the orange slider up and the red just a little bit, and obviously her skin is getting brighter. So that can be a quick way to pick a color or section of your image and make those adjustments. Same thing with saturation. You can pick on this one, and I want to really boost the saturation in skin or take it away. That looks a little crazy, but you get the idea. So that's probably too strong for what I want, but I'm going to bring those back down just a little bit to, let's see, right about there, and just bring back a little bit of saturation in just the orange tones, so something like that. Okay. Now, this is the new color grading wheel. There used to be just split toning, which gave you shadow and highlight adjustments. The later versions of Lightroom, CC, this is the desktop app. So if you're confused between the two versions of Lightroom that are out there, let me know. You want the Lightroom CC Classic version for working on your desktop of your computer. The other one is a cloud-based app. But now we have the ability to work on shadows, midtones, and highlights, and they have a color wheel associated with it. This is a lot more like what you'll see if you do any video editing in Adobe Premiere or similar apps like Apple's Final Cut Pro, any of that kind of stuff. They use these kinds of color grading tools. You can start just by, bringing the shadows over and creating a color. You'll notice it adds this little handle out here on the outside of the wheel, so you can kind of fine tune your color, and it tells you the hue, saturation, and luminance of what you've picked up here. Most of the time I don't mess with the midtones unless there's a specific reason that I want to do that, but I'm usually just pushing a little bit of cyan or blue into the shadows and a little bit of orange colors into the highlights. Now, if you want to fine tune this better, you can click on individual ones up here. So this is the shadow wheel, and it actually gives you the sliders down here. You can add a specific color tone. So if you really want to be consistent across all your images and use the exact same kind of colors, you can actually type in that on there. Blending is just how smoothly it goes across the image. So if you bring this up, it actually washes more of that color tone through the shadows and up into the mid-range. And the balancing kind of shifts where the middle of that blending happens, if that makes sense. It just, yeah, play with it, you'll see the effect. So I'm going to go with that with the highlights. Let's see, I want to go with 30. That's pretty good. I think it looks decent, and we'll keep it somewhere in there. All right. Okay. So now we're going to do sharpening. This is something that you can really go overboard very quickly if you just take it and run sharpening all the way up. You can see it's added a lot of texture, kind of almost like the clarity button, but it's a slightly different amount. But one of the things you can do is this masking effect. Now I'm going to hold down the Alt key on a PC, Option on a Mac, and then slide this up. And what it's doing is giving you a preview of where this sharpening adjustment is going to affect. So if you leave masking all the way down here at 0, it's sharpening everything in the image. As you slide this up, it's moving the sharpening effect more and more to just the high contrast edges in your image. So I use this a lot to determine where I want to have that sharpening occur. I like to have it somewhere where most of the solid areas of skin are not being sharpened, but the edges are, especially in the eyes, are getting a nice, it kind of jumped on me, a nice amount of sharpening going on. So we'll go with that. Noise reduction, you can, that's a whole other video again. Typically I'll do something, even with a good image, I'll do just a hint. And then we're going to just drop down to the effects panel, which is post-crop vignetting. Up to you if you like really putting heavy vignettes. This is all kinds of things. I typically just do about a -5 just to kind of give a little depth to the edges. I don't like to put a whole lot, and frankly I hate the white on this. I don't know, I've never seen an image that I thought looked good with this. That's my opinion. If you like it, run with it, that's cool. But I'm gonna put just a hint of negative on there. You can adjust the midpoints and feathering. The highlight thing, so if you, just to show you how that works, if I bring this up, you can see that light up there in the right. As you slide the highlight, it's bringing back highlight areas on the edges so that it doesn't affect those. So just to show you what that does. Go back to somewhere in there, whatever. Okay. So that's pretty much all of the overall adjustments that you can do. Now, one more thing before we're done. I want to show you the graduated and radial filters, and a little bit of the adjustment brush. These are really cool at adding some special effects. Now, one thing that you want to kind of get in your head when you're working with these is Lightroom remembers the last setting you used before you actually come in here and click to use the tool. So right now it's got just an increase in exposure of 0.62. So if I come over and just create a gradient, you can see that it's increasing the exposure across this side of the image. Now, if I go back and adjust this like so, and click off of that, and then come back and click, it's back to just the 0.62. In other words, it doesn't remember that adjustment that I did after I created this gradient. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. Now, if I reset this to 0, and then come in and create a gradient, and then increase it, and turn that off, and create a new one, it's back to 0, because I made that adjustment resetting to 0 before I created a new gradient. It's a little bit weird to get your head around, but once you're used to that, it's not a big deal. But if you're always struggling with, well, I've got all these things that I've adjusted and I can't figure out how to get it back, that's why it's remembering that. It's any change you make before you actually apply that gradient or radial filter or even the brush onto your image. Okay, so I wanted to kind of emphasize that because it is a tricky little thing, and if you're not aware of how it works, it can kind of throw you off. So what do I want to do with this? Well, I'm going to come over here and actually use this to push some color into it. I'm adjusting the temperature to do this. You can actually also come down here to the hue, but I want to just create this kind of wash of color and give that highlight flare some color. And that's one of the powerful things about these gradients, is that you can really, you know, fine-tune and adjust the lighting in your image. So if, say for instance, you want to reduce the amount of the exposure that's over here on her arm on this side, you can do the same thing, and then just kind of bring this over like so. And I'm going further than I would just to show you the effect, but that helps you kind of balance out some exposure issues that you might run into if your lighting wasn't absolutely perfect. Okay, so we've got the gradient across there. I do want to create a bit of highlighting on the eye, so I'm going to create just this little oval like so, put it right in the middle of the eye, and just bring up the exposure a little bit. I got to invert it so it's only inside of this filter. Then I'm going to bring up the highlights as well, bring up the shadows, and boost the clarity just a little bit. Okay, so that adds just a nice amount of light into her eye. Now you can kind of turn that on and off to see the adjustment here. If you think you might have overdone it or not done enough, this lets you kind of get a good look at that, and I do think that's maybe a little too much. I like to keep this to look somewhat natural and subtle. Okay, now you have another eye. You can click on this control dot in the middle of this and then right click on it and duplicate it. So then you can drag one over here, and now you've got the same effect on both eyes. You can go back and adjust it if you need to. Now with this, I want to take care of a little bit of the shadowy under eye look here. Everybody deals with this kind of thing, so I'm going to use the adjustment brush to do that. Now, brush controls are down here. You actually have two separate brushes that you can work with and an eraser, so you can create different settings for different brushes. It depends on how you want to work. But I like to work with this setting where the flow is at around 50%, so it doesn't just blast this effect into the area that I'm working on. And honestly, I don't have anything set here, so I'm going to bring up the exposure just a little bit and then keep working with that across those areas. Maybe a little more. It's just kind of back and forth until you get the amount of effect that you want. Because again, I want to keep it, yeah, see, that went too far. I want to keep it subtle and natural looking. And then a little bit over on this side. See, so just so you see the effect, if I bring flow all the way up in there, it just adds too much effect too quickly and doesn't give me the control that I want. So I'm going to bring that back down somewhere in there. I like to add just a little bit into the iris as well, so it brings out the color of her eyes, and maybe just where that highlight is. We'll do a few little hits of it there. All right, so let's see what we've got. That is pretty darn cool. All right. Okay, one more thing I want to show you with these filters, and this is just to show you how this works. I may or may not decide to actually use it, but if you come back in and create another gradient, say, I'm going to change the color hue a little bit, just to create a different kind of look with this. Let me see, let's go ahead and pull that over. I've done this a few times to create kind of lighting effects and things like that, but I just want to show you that down here underneath all the adjustments that you can do is this range mask. Now there's a couple different ways you can use this. Color and luminance are the primary ones that are available. I always, most of the time, use luminance. If there's a particular color in your image that you want to, say, desaturate or whatever, you can use the color range. But then you have this slider. So in luminance, what this does, and that's the light or dark of your image, so you can take this up out of the shadows so it only affects some of the highlights here, or vice versa, take it out of the highlights so it's just a little bit of a hint of that color into the shadows on this side of the image. Actually, that looks kind of cool. There's a smoothness. I can't talk. There's a smoothness slider here, so that just changes how subtle the gradation into that effect looks. And maybe just to make this more obvious, I'm going to take the exposure down a little bit. That's kind of cool. I might actually like that. Maybe not quite so far with that, but just to push that side of the image down so it has this subtle effect. But that is a really powerful tool that they built into these filters. So play with that. You can create some really cool things. Now, the last thing I want to show you is actually the cropping adjustments that you can do. And typically, I actually save this for the end of my editing, unless I already know that like there's just a big light stand over here and I'm just going to crop that out. The main reason I do that at the end is because if you go on a round trip to Adobe Photoshop and then back, if you crop, say for instance you're working on a headshot, and if you crop in like this and then take that to Photoshop and edit it and bring it back, you can't get the rest of that back, because or at least not with the edits that you did in Photoshop. The editing that you do in Photoshop applied to only what was cropped and not the rest of the image. So I typically do all the cropping at the end of any editing that I'm doing. That's just the way I work. Free to do whatever you want on that. But inside of this, so there's a aspect ratio that is locked, and what that means is that as you scale this up and down, it maintains the same aspect ratio, or the relative distance on each of the sides of the image. If you unlock that just by clicking on that lock, you can put it to any random kind of shape that you want. There are also presets. So for instance, if you just like a 16 by 9, which is kind of the widescreen standard for television, you can pick that one. If you want to go even further, or a slight adjustment to that, 16 by 10. There's all these, and you can even do a custom by entering in your own numbers. So I'm going to go with the 16 by 9. Now you can see also I have these guides on here. By hitting the O key on your keyboard, you can cycle between different types of crop overlays. So a straight in the middle. This is kind of a fun one if you have things that are on a diagonal through the image. A little bit of adjustment to the rule of thirds overlay. There's the Fibonacci thing. So I typically always leave it just on the standard rule of thirds. Now you can also come over here off to the side of it, adjust the angle. There's also a slider for that, but depends on how you want to work with that. But somewhere in there looks pretty good to me. And then you just click on that and it applies that crop transformation. So there you go. Now, I didn't go over any of the spot removal. You know, if you click on that, you can get rid of acne pretty easily. It automatically will pick a point like so. I actually do most of that work in Photoshop with the healing brush, just because it's a lot faster than how the spot removal tool here in Lightroom works. But if you want to stay in Lightroom, that's a pretty handy little tool for being able to get rid of blemishes and such. So that's it for this demo. There was actually quite a lot in there, and I hope you got some valuable content. Again, this is what we're going to be doing each week. So if you like that, sign up, and we'll see you next week. And keep in mind that studio shoot coming up February 27th will be a pretty awesome painterly look demonstration. So if you're interested in that, make sure you get into the mentor level membership. You guys have a great day.